Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Laura, if you can just please bring up the slides again. Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. Thank you so much for joining us, and a special thank you to those of you from Namibia. It is a public holiday, so I'm sorry about that, but we missed it, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Kerry Smalley. I'm the Marketing Director at USB Executive Development, which is basically the short course arm of the business school. On behalf of ED, as well as the USB Alumni Association, welcome to the third in our series, the second last webinar of 2021. I'm really happy to see guests from across the world, Sweden, London, Italy, Namibia, Mauritius. It really is an incredible thing, this opportunity that remote events have given us. And I'd also, as I mentioned, because of the overwhelming popularity of this webinar, I must say it is the highest subscribed webinar we have run, with over 500 registrations. We couldn't accommodate everyone on Zoom, so thank you and welcome to those of you joining us via the live stream on our YouTube channel. We can't see you or hear you, but please do still make comments in the comment section and pose questions throughout, because we are monitoring the chat. And as I said, unfortunately, the live streaming guests couldn't engage in the poll, but we've still noted your answers. So I'm just gonna go straight in. And those of you who've been in our previous webinars, I have seen a few of your names. I just want to go back. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself for those of you, but I'd like to clarify what I mean when we speak of the conscious leadership series and how it came about. So basically, a conscious leader is a leader who considers the whole person in their leadership style. So by this, I mean all the facets, both personally and professionally. And I mean, obviously, COVID-19 has meant that these facets of ourselves are continuously and often visibly overlapping, intertwining, butting heads, and really needing to be managed. And this is life. This is life now. And businesses and leaders need to account for this shift in their models, in their capacities, in their processes, in order to maintain an engaged workforce, and obviously to maintain a supportive culture. So, with the theme of conscious leadership in mind, these 4 topics for the series were basically conceptualized on feedback from our clients, from you, from the audience, in terms of specific challenges that businesses are dealing with now. And I most certainly can relate to today's title. And very interestingly, this sort of concept of technology and digital transformation and digital literacy and literacy has come up time and time again in our previous webinars. So it really is a pervasive theme. So just to reiterate the topic today, it is making sense, the tech, the digital, and the data, how conscious leaders approach the challenges of data illiteracy, technology, and digital transformation in the workplace. So, before we start, I'd like to go through the order of proceedings. Please keep your video on if possible, and especially if you ask a question. But when the webinar is actually underway, please, can you turn your mic off so that there isn't a lot of background noise? And obviously there will be a time at the end for questions, but please don't wait for that time. Please type the questions in the chat box throughout. Please interrupt, raise your hand. I will call on you to ask the question, or I can ask the question for you. And I'm going to put the questions in sort of themes so that we're not interrupting, every 5 minutes. Please be polite, but not too polite. So this is a conversation, not a question and answer session. So I'm very excited to hand over now to one of ED's most popular facilitators, and the director of the Institute for Futures Research at Stellenbosch University. So this is Dr. Morne Mostert, who will be steering our conversation today. Morne is joined by other conscious leaders. So we have Omeshnee Naidoo, who is Head of Information Systems at the City of Cape Town. Armin, Wieland, who is the founder and MD of V5 Digital Marketing Agency in Windhoek. We have Maritza, who's Head of Data at RCS, part of the BNP Paribas Group. And finally, USB's own Head of Teaching and Learning, Professor Martin Butler. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend this time introducing them because you would have had an opportunity now to read these slides, and no doubt what they do will also come up in this conversation. So that's it for me for now, and I hand it over to you, Morne.
Kerry, thanks so much, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. What an overwhelming response to this webinar. We had over 500 registrations. Thank you so much for joining us from all over the world as we engage this morning in this fascinating topic, the relationship between conscious leadership, sense-making, and the whole world of data and technology. Of course, an absolutely massive issue, but to help us understand all of that on this morning's show, we heard, as you have been introduced to our stellar panel. Really people who have been there and done that. And I'm going to encourage them to bring their realities to us, to bring their learnings to us, to be bold and to present us with challenging thinking that will help us to advance our organizations. A challenging topic indeed, making sense, the tech, the digital, and the data. It does make me think about the old idea that if technology is the answer, then what is the question? As I greet you here from something formerly known as the office. Perhaps to my panel, I could ask as an introductory question, when we reflect on the idea of conscious leadership and the relationship that has with this emerging, almost overwhelming relationship with technology, the digitization process, the data that's sweeping over us like massive tsunamis. What's the relationship then, would you say, between conscious leadership and our relationship with technology? Any thoughts?
Sure, happy to get started. Okay.
Omeshnee, go for it.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Martin.
Martin and then Omeshnee.
Morne, to get the ball rolling, I think there's a duality. I think on the one side, we all appreciate that technology shapes the business environment and there's opportunity like there's never been before, of which today is a stunning example. So I think both in terms of growth on the top line, operational efficiencies, there's a huge amount of opportunity. And as a conscious leader, we need to harness the value from technology. And then on the flip side of the coin, I think there are ethical challenges, there's security challenges, there's a lot that the technology is doing to our employees, invasion of privacy, and we need to balance the power and the growth opportunities embedded within technology with the negative, the dark, the challenging side. And as a conscious leader, you cannot sit on a senior management level in an organization and not be aware of both sides of this argument.
Martin, thank you. That already lays such a rich landscape of concepts. Omeshnee.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so Martin, I tend to agree with you in terms of, I think leadership style is really important in this day and age and going into the future. I think we've seen the digital landscape just expand and disrupt industries such that it's completely changing the way industries are working. And so from that perspective, I think when I think conscious leadership, it's very much about adaptability and the ability to be able to not just think kind of from a traditional bureaucratic one-way approach, but really as we think into the future as leaders, or even in this current world that we're living in, it's this constant change and about being able to adapt to that change. And I think the realization also that trends are always on the move and it's just becoming faster and faster and faster. And I think conscious leadership is something that, I think going into the future is about embracing the we of how we do things, as opposed to how am I a leader? It's how do I create all those leaders around me, and how do I pull of all the forces and all of the knowledge that everyone has, as opposed to just using my knowledge to lead people.
Omeshnee, thank you. Rich words indeed. And I'll come back to you, Omeshnee, I guarantee, and challenge you on whether those beautiful words are reflected in government where you serve currently. We'll be back with you later. Maritza.
I don't doubt that'll be an interesting conversation, Morne.
I want to add on, yes, I want to add on to the idea of duality and managing change, because in this knowledge or digital economy that we are living in, there's been many impacts on the human or the person. And I think two of those that I want to call out that I think has had big impacts within our organizations is the idea around instant gratification and disconnect. So our world is becoming more competitive. Our customers, our stakeholders are becoming more, the expectations are increasing and we have to deliver faster. But at the same time, we have this idea around discontent and not discontent, but disconnect, and a concern around the future of work. If you think about automation. So we've got people who are worried about, do I have the right skills to survive in this constantly changing world? And I'm doing my job in this context of increased requirements. So as leaders, we have to find that balance between making sure that we are finding those connections with our stakeholders. So we have to deliver to their requirements, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we are also helping our teams through this change and protecting them from too much change or too much requirement. So that's quite a difficult job from a leadership point of view, is to find that balance.
Right, gosh, what a circumspect panel of guests we have, almost perhaps too broad-minded to take their own views in the argument. Armin, is conscious leadership something that's important for smaller businesses, or is this a luxury that large organizations can indulge in?
Absolutely. No, I think, well, I'm kind of representing the smaller business, I guess, on the panel here. And first of all, thank you all for joining us again this morning, especially those from Namibia. We have a public holiday here, but I see a lot of well-known faces, which is great. And yeah, just a warm welcome again to everybody, from Namibia to the rest of the continent. And also, I believe we have people joining us from Europe, which is fantastic.
No flags on.
So indeed, I think it's definitely not a luxury. It is something which needs to be embraced. Doesn't matter the size of the business. Maybe just to put it in my own little simple world is, for me, it's about removing what I call the fear of this beast technology. And I think that's very important. How do we remove fear? Because I think a lot of people, like for instance, Martin and I believe Maritza and Omeshnee are getting very excited about technology, and we can talk about it for ages, and our eyes start blinking when something new comes out. But I think maybe for some of you in the audience, and I think definitely for I would say for the broad population, that wave or that tsunami which you were talking about is definitely possibly a threat. And for me, it's about how do we remove this fear about the technology? How do we take as many as people along on this, I would say, on this amazing journey of really embracing technology? Because I mean, we all know it's definitely making our life easier. It is making us more competitive. And it's ultimately about us all leading ideally a better lifestyle. And I think we have to acknowledge also that it's not complicated, but it's a complex topic. And we also have to realize that it's moving in a non-linear fashion. So and I don't have the answer actually to your question, but just kind of just wanted to emphasize that the role we have to take as leaders is about removing that fear ultimately, and taking as many people along as we can. And I think also,
Armin, thank you. I think you're being a little falsely modest there with the role of small business, because as we know, it is a completely disproportionate employer. And certainly from a growth perspective and future perspective, which of course we're always interested in, the role that it's playing, and that indeed that it has to play, has to expand. But I think I interrupted you there, Armin.
Yes, you did interrupt me, and now I actually lost my train of thought. But
I'm so sorry.
I'll get back to it.
It's a disruptive world.
Indeed. Just carry on, Morne.
Armin, thank you. But perhaps, colleagues, let's get into the tech a little bit. And with the caution that I've learned from all four of you now in your introductory words, that we should be very careful on the balance here, both of the, and as a diehard consultant, I'm already seeing the 2x2 matrix here. There's the benefits and the dangers, and there's the hard tech and the humans. I can spend hours on this. But you've given me a fair warning here that it's not all, of course, about the technology. But let's then talk about the technology and then transition into the human just a little bit later. Just kicking us off on the technology. Martin, you're a leading researcher in this environment. Just what do we mean by the language just seems to be utterly confusing. It seems that it's sort of woven into the conversation from all sides, terminology around AI and big data and all the rest of it, digitization. Give us a sense, Professor Butler, of what do we mean when we refer to the world of technology and big data? What does that mean?
Yeah, Morne, when you throw in the Professor Butler, I have to give you a very intelligent sounding answer there, which I don't have, because I pride myself on trying to keep things simple. And for me, Morne, I always like to reduce it to one of the first seminal theories that emerged in information systems, which is a socio-technical theory. And if you read this article, which is 50 years old, the research was done because business in the 1970s did not reap the benefit from the technology that was promised by the vendors. And I think you can go to every business person on this call and they would nod their heads and say, well, we seem to be still there 50 years later. And the essence of the socio-technical theory says that it's not about the technology and it's neither about the humans. It's about the humans using the technology and how these two worlds are coming together. And it gets back to exactly what everybody was saying now. As conscious leaders, it's not about the investment decision to implement the latest and the greatest ERP system or online system or mobile application. Neither is this necessarily about engaging with our employees and making them digitally proficient. It's about how do we actually get the employees to use the technology. And that for me is the essence. And when we get to big data, Morne, I like to stir the class a little bit, probably not as much as you do. But we have these definitions of big data, and the definition is all about the V's and volume and veracity and velocity, and IBM popularized this. But I like to think of big data as the data that we have at our disposal to do things that we did not think about when we gathered the data in the first instance. And that is important for me, because for 40 years, we gathered data to do something. Today, we have data because we have digitized business processes. And that data, and that's Maritza's world, that data has promised to it that if we can think creatively and innovatively, we can do things that we couldn't have dreamt before, because everything is digitized, measured, and we have insights that we did not have before.
Thank you, Martin. Let's use that idea a little bit, Maritza, and actually ask you about that. So if this is about what can we do now that we have all of this technology that we couldn't do before? You're in the world of financial services, part of global BNP Paribas group. Have banks changed at all?
I would say yes and no. So yes, because there's definitely, our world is becoming so competitive, and financial services is becoming so competitive. The big banks are not just competing with other big banks anymore. They are now competing with financial startups. They are competing with retailers and sort of non-traditional banks who are providing financial products. And in many cases, those financial products are far more aligned to what customers, specifically in Africa, need. So I think banks are definitely changing. The question maybe is, are they changing quickly enough? So definitely there are products, financial products in the industry that's, like I said, is more aligned. I think there's also definitely a question around, are we in the industry doing enough to educate our customers? So all of the big banks, if you look at their strategies, have financial inclusion and financial education in their strategies. However, are we doing enough to execute on those strategies? Where is our focus really? Is it on product development, or is it on our customers and what they need? So I think definitely around financial inclusion and education, there's still a question. I think the smaller companies or the startups in the industry, they are doing really interesting stuff with data to understand their customers better and to design better products. But I also think, that the smaller company or startups are less risk averse than the big banks. So the startups are more willing to use new technologies to go to the cloud. So they might be developing faster, but their challenge is funding, whereas the big banks have the funding but are more risk averse. So the answer here, and you are starting to see this in the industry, is partnership. So a lot of the big banks are partnering with financial startups. Right. So yes and no.
Right. I mean, that music, the music of that language really works for me as a strategist. Risk, competition, the customer. Omeshnee, I did promise I would come back to you. Sitting as you are in your comfortable seat there at the city of Cape Town.
Morne, sorry, can I ask a question quickly?
Yeah, please, Kerry.
Sorry, just going back to Maritza, your comment about, what small businesses and startups are doing. And obviously funds are the sort of the challenge. How can these businesses prioritize though? Because, if I in terms of using the funding in the right way, I mean, could you give us any guidance in terms of, and I know this is a very broad question, but how do these businesses prioritize on the right thing? How do you know? Because there are so many options that could help you, and there's so much, data is that data is going to save the world. But how do we go about actually prioritizing, what to start with first? From my perspective in the marketing environment, it will definitely be whatever will bring me closer to my client.
So I'm going to start off with what I see as the biggest difference between corporates or the big banks and smaller companies or financial startups. I think that financial startups are more focused on their core capability and how to enable that core capability and how to use data and digital transformation, specifically around that core capability. I think the big banks and big organizations are not focused enough. So, in many instances, we are making 1 millimeter progress in 1 million directions. So that's the first big difference is focus. And then the second one is because the smaller companies are so focused on that core capability, they're far more focused on their customer and what the customer needs and how that core capability can enable the customer. With bigger organizations or the big banks, the focus hasn't always been on the customer. That is changing. I'm going to say that's definitely changing, and it's not true for all of the big banks, but the focus has been more on product development for sure. So that I think is the big difference. And when it comes to data, and like you say, there's so much we can do, and there's so much possibility. For me, it is about understand what is the value that data and digital transformation can bring specifically for your organization and your customer. And that starts with a conversation. That starts with actually understanding what are your people in your organization and your customer need, and then fulfilling that need.
That core focus. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kerry and Maritza. Omeshnee, I'm not going to let you go. And in fact, Maritza just teed that up beautifully. So there you are, Director of Information Systems at the City of Cape Town. We've heard from the other panel members that the theme which Martin introduced, that this is about thinking deeply about what can be done differently now that we have all of this technology. You heard from Maritza talk about risk, the customer, the competition. We can debate whether the City of Cape Town has any competition of any sort. And I'm curious, Omeshnee, about what government, local governments can and should do differently in your view, now that they have access to all of this technology. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for that question, Morne. And actually very similar to financial sector. I think it's been interesting, as we've watched the big banks and as Maritza has spoken to kind of the bringing in of fintech and the ability for that to almost make these dinosaur banks that rethink how they work and how they think about their consumers. I don't think that's very different for government. Sometimes I call it the curse of Google, in that now everyone can search and type everything and find all the data that they want in order to have, much more factual conversations. And I think in the government space, we're finding that that's also allowing our citizens to actually really not just reimagine how government should be working, but really to question government in terms of how efficient we are. And I think in the past, it was all about how do we get better at service delivery and kind of get operationally efficient. But now that conversation is changing into this, individualization and personalization for how do you personalize the actual customer and consumer services and that industry behind it. And I think that for government, I kind of always joke, we see the consumer wanting change, and private sector takes on that change as fast as they can, and government slowly follows, and legislation even more slowly follows after that. And by the time we've caught up, the next change has already arrived tenfold. Yeah. But I think that, what you're finding is that government across the world has now seen that, that's just not good enough to be slow at change, and that, adapting to change faster is just part of the norm of how government needs to work. So yes, I think we can probably have 100 conversations about whether government's doing that faster enough. But without a doubt, I think we're seeing that, that those kind of government units across the world really that are taking that more seriously are seeing that ultimately the economies are more successful, and that their citizens are absolutely embracing those opportunities, and that the reality of government doesn't have a choice. I think in the past, where we just saw digital and data as a nice to have, as creating some operational efficiencies to improve the business of government, now I think there's this huge reality that's sitting in, which is actually, if you don't embrace it, you are going to really see the negative effects of that at all levels in terms of the country and the economies.
Very good. It's good to know that you're feeling the pressure there. Let's actually move now a little bit to that human world. So if we have access to all of this new technology, and there's so much more that we can do with it, these relationships now that we have with humans, whether they're customers or citizens, given the representation we have, or business owners or leaders. Of course, you know, what we found fascinating in our own work here at the Institute is as we've seen a growth in curiosity and technology, we've had more and more requests to talk about what it means to be a human being. And I think that's really been quite fascinating, something we never really had to wonder about because it seemed to be sort of obvious. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those human dimensions and how they relate to the world of technology, that socio-technical imperative that Martin spoke about earlier. And in fact, Martin, perhaps I could start with you here. You've done some fascinating research on the idea of resilience. And I know that, of course, you know, that concept means a great deal more to you than it does to any of us. But when you refer to digital resilience, is there a technology and a human component to that? Just unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah, the human must be able to unmute themselves before using the technology appropriately. Morne, absolutely, but I think resilience is actually the perfect vehicle to explain that. I feel slightly uncomfortable with the human and technology duality, and it's a little bit like one of my party tricks is when a company asks me to come and help them to develop a digital strategy, I normally start by saying, unfortunately, I'm not able to because I don't understand what the digital strategy is. Because I don't think there's something like a digital strategy. I think there's something like a strategy that is deeply infused with the transformation of technology. And when we look at digital resilience, it's not about what are the technologies and how do we empower people. It's about that middle space of, you know, Morne, it's like having a gym and going to the gym and knowing what to do versus physically being on the circuit and exercising on the gym.
I've heard about
that. Yeah, so have I. Wanda made an interesting comment. She said that banks and financial services are moving towards less customer interaction and automated answering machines and that's what we use. And I often say to the students, in our quest to see how the digital is different, we forget to see how it is the same. When my father went to his butcher 50 years ago, the butcher greeted him and said, "Welcome, Mr. Butler. Our sirloin is great today, and would you like a normal order of 2 kilograms of boerewors?" Because they knew him, they knew his desires, and they served him as an individual. And I think Omeshnee referred to that as well. If we use the technology to do the things that people have valued for the last 50 or 100 years, we're using it appropriately. We are still meeting the inherent desires of our customers. And what Armin is doing is just saying, we've always had customers. We always wanted to delight the customers. We always wanted to serve you and understand your needs. But today we have technology that helps us to do that. And we can actually do that which you've always wanted so much better today. And I think my Amazon account is a perfect example. When I log into Amazon Kindle and I see the books that they recommend for me, I simply do not have time to read all of those books because it's all the books that I actually want to read because they have 10 years of data of what I read, what I enjoyed. They actually know the books that I purchased and I didn't complete reading, and they knew the books that I read in 1 or 2 days, and that forms their interaction with me.
A dreadful indictment on a professor who's not reading as much as he should. Armin,
sorry, I just wanted to add to that. You know, I think that actually, if we actually have a look at, you know, the recent crisis that we've just gone through, though, over this last year, I think what started off as many corporates and organizations needing to move to remote working has been a great case study around this kind of how do you bring human and digital together, right? And I think a year down the line, everyone will say they love and hate working from home. You know, and a lot of that is because of the fact that, you know, they love the convenience of working from home, of not having to travel with all of the traffic and just having probably, I guess people will probably say, well, the work-life balance is really there or not. But, you know, I think what people really miss, though, is that human interaction. And I think when we start to look at leaders of the future, I think leaders of the future that can figure out that balance for their people and themselves, it's going to be a very important factor of future leaders in terms of being able to really delve into the social needs of people in the workplace versus just the technology needs, and really understanding how you can bring those two together. I think it's going to be a very interesting kind of thought process of the future and how that works and how we'll see successful organizations doing that.
Let me push you on that a little bit. How could governments do that?
So from a government point of view, I think that we're starting, and I actually don't think it's that different from government versus other sectors, to be honest with you, Morne, on this particular topic. I think hybrid approaches and flexibility seems to be what people are looking for. And I think if we figure out how you push technology to answer to those needs for the humans in the workplace, versus to answer also to the social needs in that hybrid type of approach, is probably going to be, the way we see the future being embraced. So I foresee, models like hot desking approaches in the workplace, flexible kind of working times is really going to be the space that we're going to start to see organizations moving into. And, I think that leaders are actually going to potentially either struggle or very naturally evolve to that, depending on their leadership styles. So I think that leaders are going to have to learn and really have capabilities and skills that they grow in terms of learning how to deal with this, hybrid approach. How do you deal with not having everyone in the office, but knowing that everyone's getting what they need to be done? How do you as a leader figure out, how to get your teams around for a coffee break versus not? And how do you consciously start to sense check where your people are at and what your team dynamics is like, in the workplace. And so those are going to be the types of skills and very much the softer skills that's going to be needed in leaders in order to be able to bring that together. So bringing together the efficiencies of technology alongside having a very productive team, I think is going to be an interesting discussion in terms of future work.
Thanks, Omeshnee. Maritza, yes, please. Yes. Go ahead.
So I want to make a comment around digital resilience, but just building on what Omeshnee said, because I think what you are talking about and what it feels like is creating safety as a leader in our environments. And I want to take that a little bit further and also then address the comment that was made in the chat. So technology, as leaders, and specifically as data and digital leaders, I think we have to ask the really hard questions around ethics and how we use technology, or how we bring technology and the use of technology and ethics together. Because if we're going to create safe workspaces, if we're going to create a safe world, in spite of all the increased growth in technology and digital and data, then we've got to think about how do we use technology to augment human capability and augment human creativity rather than replace those capabilities. So when we have digital and data, specifically AI initiatives in our organization, as leaders, it's our duty to ask the question, yes, we can automate that process, but can we then reapply that capacity in a different way? Can we then upskill those people? Can we cross-skill them? Can we give them different opportunities within the organization? And just to close off, that I think answers the comment in the chat as well. So yes, we are using chatbots to answer routine questions in financial services, but that is to make agents available to have personal conversations with customers who are not asking routine questions, but who has issues and questions that an agent, a human has to answer. So those two things go together. And I think it's our duty as leaders to make sure that we look at both of those.
Armin, if I can come to you, you're hearing Martin sketching this conceptual landscape, and you're hearing from Omeshnee and Maritza about the speed of adoption. I have to say, we were debating hot desking and flexi time in the late 90s. So I'm just wondering, I mean, how much longer are we going to discuss the theoretical possibility of flexi time? Small business doesn't really have that luxury, does it, Armin? It just doesn't have that capacity. So, well, should we consider some flexi time? And well, we've only got so many desks. Find a desk. If you can't find a desk, go to the coffee shop.
Exactly. I know. Thanks for that.
Don't you think there's an awful lot that we can learn from the agility, the speed of adoption in SMEs that could be useful for some of these larger behemoths like banks and governments?
Absolutely. By the way, just to get back to my earlier comment, when you rudely interrupted me, may I say? No, I just meant to say that we as businesses, doesn't matter, small, big, government, NGOs, we have a responsibility. That's actually just what I wanted to add at the end. We have got a responsibility to take everybody on board on this technology journey. But back to your question, you're completely right. So I'm just talking about ourselves now, but also a lot of businesses in our sector, in our same size. So we don't actually have that luxury of discussing things now. Is it if we've got COVID, everybody has to stay at home. What do we do now? Do we need to change the policy? I think we just have to do it, and the beauty of it. That's why I actually love being in this space, that we can do it and we just do it. From one day to the next, we just switch over to everybody working remotely. Obviously, we have the luxury as such that we don't have this huge. We've got a very flat structure, obviously. Not 10,000 IT policies, which says, well, is Teams now better than Zoom, that kind of thing. So we just whatever we believe is best and affordable, even free, we use, and we rock and roll with it. And next day we are so to say online. And I think that's really the luxury we have, and the beauty of those no structures, or very 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 flat structures. And I believe in terms of how larger businesses can learn from that, I believe it's just, just kind of embracing that. And just because I think there's a lot of protocol and a lot of things wasted in large organizations. When you really think about it, and I think the whole COVID pandemic really emphasized that they mean, what does it mean? They mean nothing. So at the end, you need to perform your work, you need to, do the job, but, having all these policies around it and, arguing in task teams, is it a good thing to have flexi time? Yes or no? But, such a, as the pandemic told us, that's, you just have to move fast. And if you don't move fast, then you will be taken out. Then you don't, you can't have a meeting, then you can't get your team together. So I think, and I think one of the poll questions was, what is the, who drives digital transformation? And I firmly believe it was COVID-19 in the last year or two, because in my previous life, I was at a corporate also driving the digital transformation agenda, and telling you there was also a lot of kickbacks, not kickbacks, but rather people not wanting to do it.
Also kickbacks, yeah.
Yes, and so I think that with a situation like COVID, that really accelerates the complete digital transformation, because you have to do it, because otherwise you'll be out.
Music to my ears. If Omeshnee sends me one more request to adjust to the look and feel, I'm going to absolutely explode.
Morne, can I comment quickly on Armin?
I love it. Armin's making me jealous.
Yeah, I want to support what Armin has said. Morne, I've also heard tongue in the cheek that we don't work from home, we sleep at work. And I see there in your background, you have a table in front of your door. So you're probably sleeping in the office. You're not going, that door hasn't been used for weeks. So I want to comment on what Maritza has alluded to as well is we have research and we are probably overly ambitious, aiming for a top journal. So it's a lengthy part to show that technology does not destroy employment, period. Technology has in the history of humankind, according to our research of the last 60 years, 273 studies, never destroyed employment. It displaces employment. If you walk behind a plow and an ox to cultivate your fields and somebody invents a tractor, somebody needs to drive the tractor. And if you still want to walk behind the plow, you will be unemployed. But if you get skilled to drive a tractor, you will have better employment and higher paid employment. And when the tractor starts to drive itself in the self-driving future, you will not be able to drive a tractor, but somebody needs to manage the geographical information system and the precision agriculture, which is again a higher order of work. So technology has never destroyed employment. It has created opportunities for humans to be employed in less laborious tasks and mostly in higher placed and higher paid opportunities as well. But Morne, I want to give two practical examples from the week. I had two examples this week of conscious leadership. The first one was on Monday afternoon, sitting in a board meeting. It was the end of the board meeting where the business is in a very cyclical, it's an agricultural business, so the business is cyclical. And at this stage of the year, we always have a lot of capital to invest, and we invested for typically 4 to 6 months because we'll start using that capital early next year. And I just said to the board, and we always then look for which product do we now put it in. And I said to them, should we invest it in Bitcoin or maybe in a basket of cryptocurrencies? And I was just stared around at the room. Now, a conscious leader does not necessarily invest in crypto or in a basket of cryptocurrency or something, but a conscious leader is able to answer that question with a well-formulated argument. Right. And I'm not saying we should go into crypto, but I'm saying we should understand how it is changing the space of investment. And on Tuesday, Gartner published their annual Emerging Technologies Hype Cycle. And I would love to know of the 113 people on this call, whom had a look at the Gartner Hype Cycle. It will take you 5 or 10 minutes. You can look at the Hype Cycle and you can ask yourself, so what is the digital distributed identity? What is the challenges around non-fungible tokens? It's a document that is aimed at business people. It's easy to read. And as a conscious leader, you cannot not spend 15 to 30 minutes every year to look at the Hype Cycle and then decide whether you want to be there or not. And Morne, I always tell people I'm not on Facebook. I don't like Facebook. Facebook doesn't add any value for me. And I know I'm wrong because the rest of the world love Facebook. But I've been on Facebook. I tried Facebook. I was on Facebook for 18 months. And I really didn't want to see all your pictures in Mauritius of scuba diving and all the things that you did. So I took a decision that I don't want to be there, not out of ignorance, but out of informed decision. And that, I think, is a conscious leader around technology, understanding the perils and the promises and then making informed decisions.
Martin, thank you. I think you introduced some really important human concepts there about learning and curiosity for the conscious leader. That this is not just something that I can sort of wing and just live off the headlines. I need to just engage a little bit with that content, learn a little bit, be a little bit more curious. We could argue that smaller businesses have that curiosity purely in the interest of survival. Larger businesses struggle with that institutional learning just because of what Maritza's described as that, just moving that massive tanker. In government, if you want to hide something from a government manager, you put it in a book. Omeshnee, that's well established. So how do we?
Yeah, sorry, Morne, about that. Yeah. I actually think that larger organizations are being pushed, as you're saying, and I think I said this earlier on. I think those days of, you're the big corporate or you're the big government organization, and therefore you hold a lot of power and can go slow or can dictate the way the industry works, has changed. I think we've seen it, you know, there's so many examples out there. And I think as Martin has highlighted, I think that depending on the industry you're wishing to get yourself into or finding yourself in, I think it's important, even if you know nothing else about digital or tech or data, you know, at least understanding what that means for that particular industry you're working in is going to be really important. You know, we kind of joke around and we say, you know, Uber took over the transport industry, you know, Airbnb took over the hotel industry. You know, as Maritza is highlighting, fintechs are taking over the banking industry. In government, we're seeing so many citizen apps coming into the space and, you know, almost privatization being really questioned as to, you know, do you really need all of these government services? So, you know, I think that it doesn't matter anymore. If you're in a large corporate, you need to be thinking about the disruptors, because that disruption could actually kill that industry very quickly. And so I think, you know, the day and age of the SMMEs being the ones that are coming in and being the disruptors and being the ones that are taking over, that I think if you're sitting in a large corporate, that having that innovation mindset, having that entrepreneurship mindset is something that organizations are really starting to think about how they skill their people on that, because, you know, it's not any longer just accepted that, you know, you will just continue to be the leader.
Right. I think that's a great challenge you're giving us, Omeshnee. You know, what is that? How is that learning agenda changing, given what we now know about technology? Let me just flip the questioning on its head for a moment and ask you to reflect on how we get it wrong. How we get it wrong. So obviously, there's the risk of just ignoring it. That's an obvious way of getting it wrong. It strikes me, though, that there are instances where technology is introduced where in fact it shouldn't be, or it's introduced incorrectly, or technology investment is misplaced, or as Martin would argue, not very well considered or well informed. Let's give our guests an idea, and if you have some examples of horror stories, you're welcome to share those. I can certainly share some of those with you from my own many mistakes. But where do you think we get it wrong? Is it about our perspective on technology? Is it about how we think about the relationship with humans? Is it the relationship between technology and finance? Where are we making the mistakes here? Thoughts?
Can I go first?
Please,
because I think this was one of the hardest and probably one of the most painful lessons that I've had to learn in my own career. When I first you know, got into a management position and I had to put a data strategy down. My starting point was technology and platform. My starting point wasn't people. And I think that is traditionally how we have approached digital and data strategies in the industry. I do see that there is a shift in the industry now to start with people. What is the value of what we want to deliver to, again, our customer, as well as our partners and our employees? How can we enable them? How can we augment their capabilities? But also, what will be needed to make this successful? So what's going to have to change in our organization from a culture point of view? How do we align our data culture, or how do we drive a data culture as part of our organizational culture? And how do we drive data and business literacy? And this is where I think, again, personally, I have made mistakes in the past where I believe that my data strategy is an IT strategy or a data office strategy, not realizing that it's actually a team sport. And you get to a robust, great data strategy through partnerships and conversations with other people in your organization, like HR. Who better than HR to guide you on change management and what this change will mean to the people in your organization. With finance, who better to help you put your business case together? With learning and development, who better to partner with to think about education and skills development, etc. So I would say for me, those were the two most important lessons in my career. Start with people, not technology. Technology is the last thing you think about. And partnerships. You can't do it on your own.
Thanks, Maritza. I see Armin nodding as he's simultaneously salivating again over the luxury of having an HR department, a finance department, a legal department. Armin, but you agree with Maritza's main thesis, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's, yeah, Maritza, you just took the words out of my mouth and just did a much better job in trying to explain it actually than I would have. But just to kind of either repeat or emphasize what Maritza was saying. So it is definitely not, so the technology is the enabler, and that's, I always say that's the, you know, that's the foundation, and we want to build on top of that. But it's really about, you know, we need to take, you know, how do we take the people along? And I think Maritza explained it beautifully, that it's not only your top leadership team. Yes, they need to be on board. They need to buy into that, you know, that digital change or data change or tech change or whatever you want to call it, or digital transformation. That's very important. But one literally has to take every team along, you know, the finance, because I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity, you know, if you've got a great relationship with, you know, with your finance team, that, you know, if you can prove that, you know, there's a, you know, if we go ahead with that, that there's a, you know, for the company as such, there's a, you know, much bigger potential, you know, in terms of earning potential. Similar with HR, you know, making sure that there is a, you know, kind of selling it again as an opportunity that, you know, we can upskill people that maybe would have lost their jobs, and, you know, how can we turn that around and say, you know, there's actually an opportunity with that tech tsunami which is coming. And then also, I think, well, kind of wearing the marketer's hat, but, you know, what is it in? Because I think at the end of the day, we are essentially doing it for the customer, because the, you know, the world is moving at an alarming speed. And if we as a business are not adapting, then, you know, the customer will go somewhere else. So at the end of the day, we actually do all this change for the customer, so that the customer has an amazing experience with our brand, and essentially, you know, keeps buying from our brand. Doesn't matter what it is, if it's a, you know, product or a service. So at the end of the day, it's, you know, that for me, that tech change is about, you know, keeping the customer and actually, you know, delighting that customer going forward.
Armin, thank you. So let me just push you on that then and ask you. So in your experience working with all these smaller businesses, and I'll ask Omeshnee a similar question, although I doubt that government's ever made a mistake. What is the mistake that that small businesses most often make with digitization? What do you see?
Well, in our case, we work actually with smaller and mid-sized and actually enterprises as well. So we kind of see the complete spectrum. But I would say it's essentially that initial trust. You know, if I look at the smaller businesses, what is it, and actually making that commitment and almost being bold about it. You know, this is something new, so I can't just, you know, it's not an incremental change. It's a, you know, digital transformation always, you know, I think we have to map it out properly. But for me, it's a big change. It's a transformation. It's not a little thing you do on the side. And I think that's for me. And as soon as, you know, business owners or leaders, and it can be in small enterprises or small business, but it can also be in large enterprises. As soon as they understand that it's a transformation, and they embrace, or how can I say, they understand the, you know, the opportunity which is there. And I think that's the important thing, you know, and really selling the opportunity. And once that penny dropped, then I think the whole process is much easier for all parties involved, you know, be it from a consulting implementation partner point of view, but also from those that are actually sitting inside the business and have to do the job of selling that project or that initiative to their peers, to their leaders.
That's really very interesting, encouraging the boldness of vision for a small business, something that I think goes against the expectation. Omeshnee, and I'm going to ask Martin a similar question of what the most difficult thing is for MBA students to understand about technology. But Omeshnee, where does government get it wrong?
Yeah, I think I think we over-strategize at times, to be honest, Morne. I think it's almost a bit of the opposite of what Armin said. It shares that I think, we're great at planning. We always have a lot of plans in place. But I think when it comes down to executing on it, we're just slow at execution. And I think as government, there's a bit of this risk aversity of just not being able to fail, as you highlighted. And when you're using ratepayers and taxpayers' money, there's almost there is a no failure zone in that space because it's not expected that you will waste a cent. And I think learning how to manage that against just getting started and this typical digital strategies of fail fast approaches and agile processes is probably a real space of where government needs to really figure out and get that balance right between and be okay with that, because in the long run, it will create better solutions and faster solutions to market for our citizens versus trying to plan and strategize for years at end to become and create this perfect solution, which will never be perfect. And then taking really long to get to implementation.
That's very insightful. And of course, I'd imagine that that making sure you get an unqualified audit has something to do with the lack of agility and hyperspeed innovation.
Yes, absolutely. I think just complying in that space and needing to comply, which is very important, alongside kind of this constant need to innovate, because we know that's much needed, is a balancing act that's very interesting.
Martin, just as we finish up on mistakes or challenges, when you engage with MBA students, these are educated people, they have work experience, they're in a very, very small percentage of the country. That you think they often miss, or what is difficult for you to convey or persuade them of?
Morne, it's surprisingly very close to what Maritza and Armin and Omeshnee said now. So what Maritza and Armin argued is really that we fall in love with the technology and not the value that it can add. And I remember we have this spirally staircase at the business school, and years ago I was on the staircase, and a student that completed the module said to me, Martin, you make the technology thing sound so simple. And I said, oh, thank you. And he said, no, it's an indictment. It's not a compliment. and he was working in the technology industry, and we had a fascinating conversation. And it was, when you understand the technology, you sometimes fall in love with the technology and not the value that technology can add, as Maritza and Armin has indicated. And then on the opposite side, if you do not necessarily work in the technology sphere and space, you see it as a separate thing. You see it as a spade that is in the garage that you go and fetch when you need to dig a hole, and then you put it away in the garage again. You don't see it as being a central part of the business. So you would quite often see that students are slightly apprehensive of technology, and it's kind of a fetch and leave. I will use it when it adds value. It's not part of the thinking process of when I formulate strategy. And then it borders to exactly what Omeshnee has said now. Then it remains in that conversational strategic level, and it doesn't come into application, and we don't get the value from the technology.
That's fascinating on the conceptualization. In the last few minutes we have, I wonder if we could cast our gaze across the African continent. And of course, we have an Africa desk at the IFR, and we know that almost anything you can say about Africa, you can say the opposite, and it's also true. Hyper complex, vast, 54 countries, some disputed regions, over 2,000 languages, vast resources, over 60% of the world's remaining arable land, and likely to double in the next 30 years or so in terms of its population and its urban population. But Africa is often perceived as somehow lagging, with the notable exception of M-Pesa in East Africa, particularly Kenya, where I was just a few weeks ago. Thanks for not liking my pictures on Facebook, Martin. Our perceptions of Africa, and bearing in mind that we have a global audience in the session, people from all over the world, our perceptions of Africa and technology, it is sometimes over aspirational and sometimes, frankly, blunt, ill-informed, and crude. What do you guys see as you cast your gaze across the continent? What are you observing as trends, and what do you think we can learn from that? I'll leave that open.
Morne, sorry, Maritza, please go and then I will follow.
So what I see is opportunities, specifically around skill development and the marketing of that skill globally. So there are quite a few organizations that do fantastic work in this regard. So the one that I know of is a company that has an online, it's a platform, it's a data science platform, and data scientists in Africa can register on that platform, and organizations can register business problems that they then basically crowdsource answers to. So anyone can attempt to answer that business question or solve that business question through a data science project. Right. And then the organization can choose the best answer and run with that as a project. So I think what we as leaders have to think about is, can we embrace these alternative engagement models and resourcing models? And we should be supporting these organizations. And I'm not saying we have to not support our professional services companies, but maybe we should just also be more open-minded to employing people from elsewhere in Africa, because we're all working remotely now. There's no reason why we can't have a fully remote team. And also supporting these alternative types of skill development organizations. So that's definitely an opportunity that I see.
Very interesting. Martin.
Morne, innovation is context specific, and the African context is unique, and it's extremely diverse, and innovation loves diversity. The more diverse ideas we have, the higher the quality of the idea. And one of my favorite things to do at the business school is we have significant incoming international student groups. So we've got student groups from all across the world, and I'm then usually asked to facilitate a 2 or 4 hour session in terms of technology and innovation in Africa. And they are absolutely blown away. Yes, of course, we all know about M-Pesa, but the whole spin-off industry around M-Pesa, Bright Solomons and his team in Nigeria and what they did in securing global supply chains, innovation in MCB Bank in Mauritius, Winsinga and what the guys in Uganda is doing in healthcare. For years, I served on the panel that reviewed the applications for Demo Africa, which is entrepreneurs and launching new technology businesses. For example, that's where Twitter comes from and many of the business we have today. The entries are from across the African continent. Yes, there's a host from South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. So those are the 3 regions. But every year we had entries from across the African continent, and I'm always absolutely blown away. I don't think we will compete on broad fronts on every particular aspect, but I think there are areas, and mobile money is the best example, where Africa will lead the world, and we will continue to lead the world because we have brilliant people, brilliant ideas, and people that can actually execute on that.
Gosh, very encouraging.
If I can maybe just, thanks Martin for that. If I can just maybe just add to that, and I think Martin, you mentioned it in one of your webinars, it was like a year or 2 ago, where you said, I think Africa can be very good at, not necessarily at, coming up with the next big thing, but very good at, applying some of the technology and really make it work for, for our own unique, African problems, which we have. And I think that's really where, similar to what Maritza was saying, that, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I feel very, good about the future in terms of, what African companies, entrepreneurs can do on the continent regarding, applying the technology and, really innovating world-class solutions, that could work definitely in an African sense, and some of them actually, can be exported, like in M-Pesa. And for instance, I'm looking, for instance, at all these business in the agri-tech sector. I think there's some amazing work being done across the continent. There's also great work being done on stopping and reversing the climate crisis. I think there's a lot of, I won't say not case studies, but there's real businesses that are coming up. So I'm very positive about that we as our people on the continent are actually, very innovative, and, with the technology that is coming out all the time, I think the future will be very bright for us.
Thanks, Armin. And of course, Omeshnee, the city of Cape Town is a shining light on the continent for innovation, and particularly incubation space, Silicon Cape, and so on. What do you see?
Yeah, I think that, as you said, Morne, I think, Cape Town's a great example in terms of, when you invest wisely into specific industries, and you bring minds together, both from public and private, and be able to partner well, that great things can happen. Cape Town holds the #1 spot now in Africa in terms of new tech startups in Africa. And that has been a journey that has been brought together between public and private partnership to make that happen with very wise investments into this space. And if you talk about Africa and into the future, I think it's calls like these where we really need to encourage our leaders, because, to be honest with you, I think we've all said Africa's this unique space, and the reality of the fact that we have many factors that can be seen as crippling, can be seen as we can't do this, we just don't have enough investment, the digital infrastructure isn't where it should be, there's such big, there's such big complex issues of kind of like, can you solve the poverty problem type of issue, and I think we get so overwhelmed with all of these issues and problems that it kind of gives leaders sometimes this perception of it's better to give up. And I think that we need to really, encourage our leaders that are here in Africa to have a mindset that is strong and it's resilient, because those factors are not just going to go away. Actually, we're hitting recession and it's about to get tougher. And we need to really embrace innovation with that mindset of how are we going to overcome these difficulties, and how are we going to overcome these barriers of challenges that we have. And rather than being doomed by it, I think, the one thing that Africa is quite good at is figuring these things out. I think they kind of go in South Africa a lot of, we can make a plan. And we must enjoy that mindset and say, actually, these problems they're horrific and they're scary, but they're exciting, and they will take bold leadership and courageous leadership to solve that. And so my encouragement is really around, I think that we need more leaders that are willing to be bold and courageous, and to say that actually they're going to take risks in the space of big problems that they're trying to solve. And to know that maybe they won't get to solve the full problem, but they'll get closer if the mindset is about, how do we keep answering that question of what are we trying to solve, and keep reinventing ourselves to solve it. And I think that we've seen with tech startups in Cape Town that, by doing that, that the tech startup environment has grown tremendously. And it's amazing how they're solving global problems, not just Africa ones, and indirectly helping, the African economy by growing businesses here. So I think it's a mindset, as is kind of half the problem, and the other half is them creating the innovation of how do we solve problems, and knowing that we have those barriers in place.
Omeshnee, thank you for that encouragement. Certainly mindset and paradigms is something we study explicitly. I'm going to give our other three guests just also a final opportunity for some closing thoughts. If I'm a small business leader, or I'm a corporate leader, or I'm an academic leader, or I'm a government leader, what advice would you give me as I embark on my journey, as I engage with technology?
So I'll kick off. So as we've said, I think the starting point is always people and not necessarily technology. And then the other thing that I want to say is do not get discouraged by the quantum of the investment it's going to take to drive your data and your digital strategy, because sometimes it's about getting the basics right and just using the technology that you have. So if you don't have to go with AI right now because it's not going to add value, then don't do it. Just get the basics right and use what you have.
Armin?
Yes, if I can, yes, fantastic. If I can just add to that, maybe just an example from our environment, because we often get approached by companies, big or small, and they see something fancy on our website, and I often actually tell them, well, you don't actually need that. I mean, we would love for you to buy it from us, and it would make us more money, but often we would actually just bring them back a little bit and say, you know, for that problem you're having, you know, you don't need that, you know, that fancy thing that, you know, that bot that does everything. We can actually offer you a cheaper solution that, you know, that does that, you know, that solves your problem which you have at this point in time. So for me, it's not always about, you know, the latest and greatest, but really something, you know, purpose built, or purpose built. I don't mean that we have to build it ourselves. It could be off the shelf and just configured to your needs. But just kind of saying it's not always have to be the, you know, the glitzy thing. It can be something quite rudimentary that actually, you know, solves your business problem, especially if you're kind of in the startup phase or just wanting to, you know, to start out on the technology journey.
Superb. The last word to you, Martin.
Morne, apology to my MBA students or graduates that's heard this before. I often say that you can have a financial conversation without understanding financial terminology. You can ask, if I add all of the money that came into the bank this month and I subtract all of the money that went out of the bank this month, and what is the net that is remaining at the bottom? Or you can say, what is my cash flow? You're asking the same thing, but by asking what is the cash flow, you show appreciation and insight for that which you are dealing with. And I think I really love the topic that Kerry chose for the series, being a conscious leader. I don't think you can be a conscious leader today if you can't converse in the digital and the technology space. You have to be able to have a conversation around all the growth opportunities. What are the things that we can do? How can we delight our customers? How can we drive operational efficiency? And you need to be able to have a conversation around the ethical, the moral implications, the impact on the workforce and everything. And that I think is, you need to be able to sit in a conversation when people are talking about technology and follow the conversation and add value to the conversation. For a long time in business, we allow technology people to get away with things that they shouldn't have been doing because we didn't have the ability to ask the right questions. Nobody can present a business case at the management level where the ROI is not present, because we all understand ROI and we understand what is the return and what is an investment. And sometimes when we have technology intrinsic conversations, there's not sufficient insight and ability in the collective management team. Not talking about technology leaders, I'm talking of those outside the technology sphere, to hold the technology leaders accountable, but also to improve the level of the conversation and have a really thorough conversation so that we make the right decisions around technology.
Martin, a fantastic point to leave us. I'm going to say thank you so much to our audience and to our very special guests, Martin Butler, Omeshnee Naidoo, Maritza and Armin Wieland. It's been an absolute pleasure engaging with you this morning. I've certainly learned a bucket load, and also recently from my son, who sent me a WhatsApp message and said, if you want me to experience life outside the internet, just send me the link. Kerry, I'm going to thank you for organizing this important event and hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Morne. Shame, we have one of our audience members, Renier Vessels. He's been waiting very patiently to ask a question. Renier, can I hand over to you quickly?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. So my question stems from. So I'm a chartered accountant, and I hail from a Big Four auditing firm, and now I work exclusively in data, financial data, automation, and software integration. And in my transition from mainstream auditing to technology, I've realized that with this digital transformation journey that we're on, we might find ourselves in the space in the future where we have a lot of pieces of automation and technology that we might want to call digital debt that could be created in the future that's not properly governed, not necessarily monitored, and not necessarily maintained. And if I look at, especially in the space of AI and robotic process automation, we might find a lot of these technologies being applied in the future irresponsibly because we are not necessarily following proper agile and scrum approaches. We're not necessarily taking it through proper user acceptance testing, piloting, and not necessarily understanding all the risks involved. So I wanted to essentially ask, how do we make sure that we don't find ourselves in that space because we are all coming from different parts of the business wanting to move into an IT space? I guess that's my question.
Can I give it a go to answer? So I think you've touched on something that's really, really important, specifically in data and analytics. Again, we are very quick to put a data strategy together that is focused on the latest and the greatest technology and the trends in the industry. But what we forget is that we actually have to make sure that that is sustainable for the future. So I would say that when you put your data strategy together, what you have to concentrate on is not just the data management side of things, so the technology, but also data governance. So what processes do you have to put in place to make your implementations sustainable, but not just sustainable, but also ethical from a data protection point of view. And then, of course, we've said it so many times today, you have to have a people component as well. And that is not just sort of skills development and making sure that you have the right skills. It's also data literacy. It is also the change management that you have to think about. So it's really a multidimensional approach to data strategies. And I would imagine it's the same for digital strategy. So you can't just focus on one thing. You've got to make sure it's people, process, and tech.
Yeah, I think, sorry, let me just add to that one. So I think that, when organizations make choices to go through a digital change, whether that's transformational change or change to specific areas of the business, I think what's coming out quite clearly is, the concept of these collaborative teams and bringing together different skill sets to the table. I think what I'm hearing, when hearing you speak is probably a question of whether perhaps in your particular organization, perhaps there's a need to answer that question as to whether there is sufficient collaboration across the board, bringing the different skill sets that would be needed to avoid such challenges, such as, insufficient testing or the inability to be able to ensure that there's the right levels of governance behind the processes. I think there's this misconception at times that agile just means fast without a governed process. And those that have successfully run agile projects actually knows that it potentially comes with much more governance than even a typical overall olden kind of traditional waterfall approach. And so I think, perhaps there's a question that we need to take back into the organization around whether the collaborative team that's sitting has all of the right skills and whether you're bringing into that team those different levels of skills that therefore brings about a successful implementation factor as opposed to, to these gaps that's being called out.
Renier, it's a complex question. There was an interview with Elon Musk about 2 to 3 weeks ago where a person walked for an hour through Starbase with him. And he dropped lots of pearls of wisdom, but the one that stuck a chord with me, he said, the problem with really intelligent engineers is that they are brilliant at optimizing processes that shouldn't exist in the first instance. And he used the example of the landing legs, or movement of the landing legs, or the flaps on the Mars lander, and the amount of time that they spent to optimize that until they figured out that they didn't need to move. It can actually be fixed in position, because that's the best thing to do. And I think often one of the biggest challenges that we're sitting with when we're dealing with the concept of technical depth or digital depth that you are describing is that we are so good at optimizing that particular implementation or that automation or that RPA or what the elements that we are busy with, that we don't do what Morne's area of expertise is and take a systems view and just lift ourselves one level higher and asking ourselves about the existence of these particular components, how they work together, how they fit together, and how the entire system is improved. We get bogged down into the detail of those little elements. And it's a really, really tough challenge because it requires a different way of thinking. And Morne, we talked about humans and the focus on humans. And I mean, I also said that, and I agree with what everybody has been said, but it's actually not humans, it's human behavior. It's not about the human, it's how the human is reacting. It's not about capacitating an individual, it's about shaping how the person behaves from a security and from that perspective. And I think, Renier, you're asking a question which I truly don't have an answer, but I do appreciate that the complexity actually sits between how these components are working together. But when you get to highly competent technical people, we normally focus on the component when we optimize that at the expense of the entire system.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to stop you there if you don't mind. We are a few minutes over time. Renier, thanks for your question. I just quickly wanted to highlight our next webinar, and obviously, you know, I think it's all related. If I think of Maritza's earlier comments about the ethics, you know, similarly, Omeshnee, you touched on what we need to do as leaders, and that speaks to obviously ethical behavior and how we engage with technology and digital. So I just quickly wanted to thank each of you again very much for being here. Thank you to Morne for humoring me and for your patience. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I think that it's been very enlightening and helpful in terms of, you know, what we're trying to do. So we don't have all the answers, but I think that if some of us sort of wake up at night thinking, hang on, this could work for me, then, you know, then we've done our job. So thank you to each of our contributors, really sincerely from me. And I think I would really love to see everyone at the next webinar at the end of October. It's going to be another absolute stellar cast. So we've got Professor Arnold Smith, who was also actually on this webinar earlier. He had to leave. And then we have Professor Mary Gentile of Virginia Darden School of Business. So she was a Harvard Business School lecturer for 10 years. And she actually introduced their very first program on diversity and inclusion. So she really is an absolute leader in the field of ethical leadership. We've got Eddie Jolicoeur, who was the former CEO of the Mauritius Institute of Directors, as well as Professor Kurt April of the Alan Gray Center for Values-Based Leadership at UCT's GSB. So we do play with our competitors. It does happen, and he will be joining us at the end of October. So I really hope that you can join us for that. Thank you very much, everybody.